Hi guys, welcome to part 2 of tank tactics. There is several firing patterns as follow. Please like and leave an English comment. It's not difficult for you but it's a great support for me. Types of firing patterns. 1. Frontal pattern. In this pattern, which is used for ambushing and attacking the enemy armored column, each tank in the platoon or combat group has the ability to fire at targets in front of it. In the frontal or forward fire pattern, the friendly tanks attack the enemy tanks and equipment on the flanks, left and right sides of the combat group, at the beginning and end of the column or convoy. In this method, the tank on the right flank attacks the tanks and equipment on the right flank of the enemy, the end of the enemy armored column, and the tank on the left flank attacks the equipment and tanks on the left flank of the enemy, the beginning of the armored column. In this pattern, the targets are confronted from the flanks of the column towards its center. By hitting the first and last tanks of the enemy armored column, the possibility of movement of the middle tanks, or center, of the column is eliminated. In the forward firing pattern, the priority is as follows: from close to far, from the flanks to the center. 2. Cross-firing pattern. In this pattern, for any reason, such as the presence of ground obstacles, the friendly tanks do not have the ability to confront the tank in front of them. Instead, each tank acts against the target based on its angle of view and firing capability. In this method, which is used to confront the column passing through the enemy armor or the row approaching the enemy armor, each friendly tank confronts a tank in the opposite flank. For example, the friendly right flank tank targets the enemy left flank tank and vice versa. The priority of confronting the targets is also outside in, near to far. 3. Depth fire pattern. This pattern is mainly suitable for mountainous battlefield environments and their pathways and requires the provision of the following prerequisites. 1. A high-level deployment position for own forces. 2. Avoidance of excessive height difference between the deployment position of own forces and the path of the enemy armor column to enable firing from the high ground to the low ground given the limitations of tanks in firing in negative angles. 3. Appropriate distance between the deployment position of own tanks and the enemy's path. 4. Successful hitting of the beginning of the enemy's armor column and stopping it along the way. 5. Limitation of the width of the pathway to prevent the enemy armor equipment from maneuvering. And more. In this pattern, the left wing tank of own forces, tank number 1, targets the end tank of the enemy column, and then moves on to the front tank. The left center tank, tank number 2, targets the center of the enemy's armor column and then moves on to the tanks before the center. The right center tank, tank number 3, targets the beginning of the enemy's armor column and then moves on to the tanks towards the center, effectively stopping the movement of the column. The right wing tank of own forces, tank number 4, also targets a part of the center of the enemy's armor column and then moves on to the tanks at the beginning of the column. In this method, tanks number 1 and 2 fire in depth due to their distance from the end of the enemy's column, which eliminates the possibility of the enemy armor column retreating. In a tank platoon, different fire patterns are used to combat enemy armor, depending on the battlefield conditions and the positioning of enemy and own equipment. In combat, the prioritization of dealing with targets usually takes place based on their distance, level of threat, and importance. This prioritization is taken into account in fire patterns. When engaging targets, the own tank starts with the closest target and, in order of distance, moves on to more distant targets until all targets are eliminated. The fire patterns introduced and examined are based on Western armored doctrines, including group combat and network-centric warfare. In these patterns, a tank platoon consisting of 4 tanks is fully interconnected through the battlefield management system, with one tank responsible for commanding the platoon. To implement these methods in Eastern armor, a command tank must be used for the tank platoon, otherwise, Eastern tanks will not be able to execute the patterns correctly. Tasks such as selecting the firing pattern, prioritizing threats, and selecting targets for each tank are performed by the command tank. To move a tank platoon or group, several basic movement formations called basic movement formations are proposed. These formations are used based on battlefield conditions and the characteristics of the movement path, such as the environment's extent, the width of the passage, the possibility of maneuvering, the possibility of engagement with the enemy, etc. In the following, we will focus on these basic formations. But before that, please like and subscribe. Also leave a comment. 1. Column formation. The column formation is divided into 2 categories. First, column formation. In this type of formation, due to the width of the passage or route, there is no possibility of leaving it and moving freely alongside it. Therefore, a channeled movement takes place in a specific passage. In this formation, each tank has the responsibility of providing a specific direction for movement. The tank moving at the beginning of the path is the vanguard and provides cover and fire for the front section of the path. The tank located at the end of the formation provides the rear cover. The 2 middle tanks in the formation also cover one side of the path each. The column movement formation is used when speed is essential, and the possibility of engagement with the enemy is low or non-existent. The problem with this formation is that the coverage and firing angles of the middle and rear tanks are limited. Second, staggered column layout. This type of layout is used when maneuvering and exiting from a path or passageway is possible, albeit limited. As a result, there is no need for regular column movement. The advantage of this layout is that the middle tank in the column can cover not only the flanks but also part of the front of the column. Therefore, covering the front part of the route is not limited to one tank, and if the target is to position the tank at the beginning of the column, the possibility of maneuvering and passing through the route is provided for the rest of the tanks. This layout generally provides better coverage of the flanks and front and rear sections of the route than a regular column layout. An unsuccessful example of using a columnar movement layout was during the 33-day war in 2006, when Israeli tanks in southern Lebanon were looking to advance through narrow and low-width passageways. Hezbollah forces were trapping Israeli tanks stationed in the middle of the armored column by targeting the leading and trailing tanks. The Israelis tried to change the layout from regular column to zigzag and irregular column to solve the problem. However, this mistake not only did not solve the problem but also increased it, with tanks that had exited the column sometimes sliding on the narrow roadside and flipping over. This change in layout required certain conditions, such as a mountainous terrain, and the need for a minimum space to maneuver alongside the route without ending in a valley. Wedge layout, also known as triangular layout, is used in situations where, in addition to one or more paths or passageways, there is also significant space on the edge or side of the main route that allows for passage. In another definition, this layout is suitable for horizontal and vertical coverage and provides better flexibility in movement than a regular column layout. This arrangement is used in situations where, in addition to having one or more paths or routes, there is also the possibility of passage in a significant space on the margin or edge of the main path. In another definition, this arrangement is suitable for movement in open spaces. In wedge formation, monitoring and fire coverage are accessible towards the front and the wing's coverage is also in a desirable position. The most important element in this military arrangement is the tank, which is located in the middle of the right wing tank number 4 in the above image. In addition to monitoring and covering the fire on its own wing, the right wing, this tank also has the ability to monitor and cover the fire on the left wing. In fact, this tank is an interchangeable element for monitoring and covering the fire on both wings of the formation, and its control over these two wings changes or switches depending on the conditions. The two end tanks in the formation have the ability to cover the rear of the formation in addition to covering the wings. In wedge formation, this tank is aware of the right wing. Monitoring and fire coverage will be strengthened in this wing and vice versa. Therefore, the key element in the mentioned formation is tank number 4 in the middle of the right wing. Watch part 3 and don't forget to like and subscribe.